The skyline of Manhattan stretched out before Avery West, its lights twinkling against the darkened sky. Inside her apartment, the atmosphere was a stark contrast, quiet, almost too quiet. The soft hum of the city below was muted by the stillness of her living room. Avery glanced at her twin daughters, Zoe and Lena, who were tucked under blankets on the couch. Both looked pale, their small chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. Eli, her son, had been sick for the past few days. What started as a simple cold had escalated quickly into something more serious. His temperature spiked, his energy drained, and Avery was no longer sure what to do. It had been years since she had relied on anyone else. She had built a life for herself and her children after Declan left, determined to be independent, to protect them, without needing anyone. Especially not him. But tonight, as her son lay sick, she knew she couldn't do it alone anymore. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. Declan Stone. His name appeared on the screen, a stark reminder of the past she'd tried to bury. He hadn't been a part of her life for years. And yet, now, she had no other choice. Eli needed help, and she was no longer in a position to keep the truth hidden. Her finger hovered over the call button. She thought about the long months and years of silence, the painful distance between her and the man who had once been her husband. It was still hard to shake off the memories, but there was no time for hesitation. She pressed the button. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Avery's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard that voice in what felt like a lifetime. She swallowed hard. "Declan?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't allow herself to falter. "It's Avery. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. She could hear him shift, as if he had just realized who was on the line. His response was cautious, measured. "Avery? What's going on?" Avery glanced at Eli. His breathing was slow, but still too labored for her comfort. "It's Eli. He's really sick. I can't handle this on my own. He needs help." The words came out in a rush. The panic she'd been holding in was starting to break through. She quickly wiped away a tear, not wanting to appear vulnerable. "Please, I need you here." There was another pause, this one longer, before Declan spoke again, his voice filled with reluctance. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Avery closed her eyes, the relief washing over her, though she hadn't expected to feel this unsettled. She had made it this far without him. But now, in this moment, she realized she didn't know how to navigate the sudden rush of emotions. "I'll wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she hung up, Avery sat back on the couch. Her mind raced, torn between the need to protect her children and the flood of old memories that Declan's name stirred. She had built a life for herself without him, yet there was no denying the raw emotional vulnerability that his return had triggered. What would it mean for her life, her family, her future? Eli's slow, shallow breaths brought her back to the present. She couldn't afford to get lost in thoughts of Declan and the past. Eli needed her, and for the first time in a long while, she needed Declan. The truth was undeniable. She didn't want to need him. She didn't want to open the doors she had shut so tightly. But for Eli, she had no choice. She was going to need help. As Avery waits for Declan, she feels the weight of the situation pressing down on her, her son's health and the unresolved feelings she has for her ex. What would Declan's re-entry into her life mean for her and her children? The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across the room. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee, her mind still racing. She hadn't expected Declan to show up so quickly, and now, as she sat in the quiet aftermath of his visit, her mind was still reeling from their conversation. He had arrived exactly as promised, walking through her front door like he had never left. Declan's presence was almost too familiar, as if nothing had changed. He had jumped into action, assessing Eli's condition with a calmness that only someone with his experience could muster. But as much as he had been there for Eli, Clara couldn't help but feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. They didn't speak much after he took over the situation. Declan had handled everything with the precision and confidence that came with his wealth and status. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were back at a place she didn't want to be. Sitting now in the kitchen, Clara stared at the coffee cup in her hands, her thoughts wandering. She hadn't expected Declan's return to stir up so much, the old hurt, the unresolved feelings. When they were married, things had been different. Declan had been everything to her. But after the way he left, she had spent years convincing herself that she didn't need him, that she could raise Eli on her own. And now, faced with the reality of him walking back into her life, those old emotions felt like they had been waiting beneath the surface, ready to resurface at the first sign of weakness. Could she really move past the anger? The sound of the door closing jolted Clara from her thoughts. Declan's voice echoed from the hallway. "I'm just going to check on Eli," he called. Clara exhaled slowly, setting her coffee cup down. She stood up, her mind still heavy with confusion. She hadn't expected him to come back into her life so easily. She had expected a cold distance, not the lingering presence of the man she had once trusted. She walked into the living room just as Declan was sitting next to Eli, who was still asleep. His hand rested gently on Eli's forehead, his face serious but calm. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to watch him, how easily he slipped back into the role of a concerned father, even if he was years late to it. But even as she watched, a nagging voice inside her reminded her that Declan hadn't been there when it mattered. "Is he okay?" Clara asked, her voice thick with emotion. Declan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "He's better. His fever seems to have broken. We'll know more after the tests." Clara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Declan wasn't telling her everything. She knew he was trying to be helpful, but there was still so much left unsaid between them. The silence that followed was heavy. Declan looked back down at Eli, his hand still resting on his son's forehead. What was going through his mind? Clara couldn't help but wonder if Declan felt any guilt about missing all of Eli's milestones, about missing out on being a father. She had spent so many years trying to move on without him, but now faced with his return, it felt as though their history was suddenly reopened, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. As Declan looked up, their eyes met for a brief moment, and Clara could see the regret in his gaze. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped short, his words seeming to hang in the air. "I didn't know you were planning on keeping him away from me," Declan said quietly, almost as if he was testing the waters. "All these years, and I never knew he existed." Clara flinched at the mention of the twins. Her heart sank. She had always planned on telling him, but the years of bitterness and frustration had prevented her from doing so. The decision to keep them a secret wasn't easy, but she had made it to protect them both. She wasn't sure if Declan even deserved to know about them. After all, he had never been part of their lives. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to speak. "I never wanted to keep them from you. But I couldn't trust you, Declan. You left, and I had no idea where you were. I had no choice but to move forward. Eli needed stability, and that was the only thing I could give him." There was a long pause as Declan absorbed her words. He didn't argue, though she could see the hurt in his eyes. For a moment, they were both silent, the weight of their past hanging in the air. Finally, Declan stood up, brushing the dust off his pants. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have been there. I didn't know what I was doing, and I'm not proud of it." Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade into the background as Clara and Declan sat in the living room, the air between them thick with unspoken words. The twins had been tucked into bed hours ago, their breathing steady, but Clara's mind refused to settle. The events of the night, the sudden reappearance of Declan, were still replaying in her head. It felt like she was trapped in the same room with her past, unresolved, full of questions, full of emotions that she thought she had long buried. Declan had stayed after Eli's checkup, offering more help than Clara had expected. Yet, with each passing minute, the sense of discomfort only grew. His presence was like a shadow, lingering over her. And despite the fact that he was trying to be helpful, something felt off. She wasn't ready for this. The emotions, the questions, the old feelings that she had spent so much time trying to forget. Sitting across from Declan now, Clara's eyes couldn't help but wander to the photo of her family on the mantelpiece. A photo of her, Declan, and Eli. A snapshot of a life she no longer recognized, a life that had been abruptly torn apart. She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze returning to Declan, who was still looking at her with that same intensity that he had always had. She had forgotten how piercing his gaze could be, how it had once made her feel like the center of his world. But that was before the betrayal, before the endless nights of wondering where he was, if he even cared. "Clara?" Declan began, his voice quiet, almost tentative. He was leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied her. "I know this is sudden. I know we've been apart for years, but I can't just pretend like I wasn't part of your life. I was there once. For you and Eli." Clara felt a sharp sting in her chest at his words. They were true, but they were also too little, too late. She had spent years convincing herself that Declan's absence didn't matter, that she didn't need him. But now, hearing him speak those words, the truth of his absence was undeniable. She wanted to be angry, wanted to scream at him for abandoning her, but instead, she remained silent, the words trapped inside. "You don't get to just come back and act like you've been a part of all this," Clara finally said, her voice cold. "You left us. For years, I did everything on my own, Declan. I raised Eli. I built this life without you. You don't get to walk in now and pretend like you're some kind of hero." Declan flinched, but he didn't look away. "I know, and I can't change what I did, I know that, but I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I'm here now, because I want to be part of his life. Part of your life, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Clara's chest tightened as she fought to keep her emotions in check. What did she want? The idea of letting him back in felt like both a blessing and a curse. She had spent years pushing Declan out of her life, had learned to live without him, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep control. "I've made so many sacrifices for Eli, for us. I don't know if I can risk everything again, Declan. You left, and now you're asking to come back into our lives, just like that?" Declan looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "I'm not asking for everything, Clara. Just a chance to be a father to Eli. I know it won't be easy, but I want to make up for the years I lost. I want to be here for him." Clara swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he had changed, that he was sincere in his desire to be a father. But the scars of the past were deep, and she couldn't ignore them. Was she ready to take that risk again? The silence between them stretched on, each second weighed down by the uncertainty of what to do next. She looked at Declan, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw the man who had once been so important to her. But that man had hurt her, had walked away when she needed him most. Could she really open up to him again? "I don't know if I can just forgive and forget," Clara said finally, her voice steady but unsure. "I don't know if I can let you back into our lives after everything that's happened." Declan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, whether you want me to be or not. And if you'll let me, I'll try to make it right." For a moment, Clara didn't know what to say. How could she trust him again? How could she open up to a man who had abandoned her and their child for so long? And yet, in that moment, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just guilt or regret, it was the desire to make things right. Her mind raced with possibilities, with what-ifs and maybes. But the truth was, she didn't know what the right choice was. And Eli's future was far too important to gamble with. A sudden knock at the door broke the tension, and both of them turned toward it. The sound of footsteps from the hallway echoed in the silence, and Clara knew that their conversation was far from over. They were only just beginning to scratch the surface of what would come next. Clara is forced into an emotional decision, but is still unsure whether she can trust Declan and let him back into her and Eli's lives. The knock at the door introduces a new, unresolved dynamic. The day at the hospital had passed in a blur. Clara's mind was still racing, trying to process everything. Declan's presence, Eli's condition, and the conversation that had shifted the course of her entire life. By the time they left the hospital, her nerves were frayed, but there was no time to rest. Declan had insisted on driving them back to the apartment, offering a level of concern for Eli that was hard to ignore. As they arrived, the weight of the day's events hung over Clara. Her mind was still torn between the relief of having Declan involved and the unsettling realization that she might be opening a door she had spent years trying to close. The twins were still in their room, sleeping soundly, unaware of the life-altering conversation that had just taken place between their mother and their biological father. Clara walked into the apartment, feeling an unfamiliar tension in the air. It wasn't just the medical worry about Eli that gnawed at her. It was the looming emotional conflict that she couldn't shake. Declan had come back into their lives, and despite his reassurances, she still wasn't sure what he wanted. Was he truly here for their son? Or was this about something else? Something that could undo everything she had worked so hard to build? Declan followed her into the living room, his footsteps heavy, his gaze lingering on the family photos that lined the walls. Clara glanced at him, noticing how his eyes flicked over the images of their family, all the years he had missed flashing before him. She couldn't help but feel the sting of bitterness rise in her throat. How dare he come back now and act as though nothing had happened? He must have sensed the change in her mood because he stopped a few feet away, his expression now more guarded than before. "Clara, I know you're upset. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. Hell, I don't even know if I deserve that." Clara's stomach twisted. She didn't want to hear his apologies. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing that, deep down, she still cared. She had worked so hard to move on, to build a life without him, and the last thing she wanted was to fall back into the mess they had left behind. "I don't know what you want from me, Declan," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been doing this alone, raising Eli, managing everything, without you. And now, you show up expecting what? That I'll just open the door and let you walk back in? That we'll all just forgive and forget?" Declan stood still, his face reflecting guilt and regret. But it wasn't enough. Clara couldn't let him in again. Not when everything she had worked for was at risk. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away," he said, taking a small step toward her. "I just want to be part of his life. I want to do right by him, by both of you. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to fix them. I can't just walk away from him again." Clara felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. She had never allowed herself to truly believe that Declan wanted anything more than his wealth and success. He had always chosen his career over their family. He had left her to raise Eli on her own, and now he was standing here, asking for another chance. But Eli needed a father, whether she liked it or not. Maybe it wasn't about her anymore. "I'm not saying you can't be part of his life," Clara replied, her voice wavering despite her attempt to remain firm. "But I don't know how much I can trust you. You've been gone for too long. You can't just come back and pretend everything is okay." Declan's expression softened, but there was still a trace of frustration behind his eyes. "I'm not pretending, Clara. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I've hurt you and I can't change that, but I want to try. For Eli. For us." Clara turned away from him, her eyes falling on the window, staring out at the city's skyline. The world outside seemed distant, as if she were trapped between two lives, the one she had made for herself and her children, and the one that included Declan. She didn't want to go back to the anger and pain of their past, but she was afraid that by refusing him, she would be denying Eli the father he deserved. But there was more to it. There was the fear that if she allowed Declan back into their lives, it would never be the same. That the past, everything that had hurt her, would come rushing back. She didn't want to risk the possibility of more hurt. "Declan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've spent so many years building a life for Eli without you. I can't just let everything go. I can't undo all the decisions I've made to protect him." He nodded, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I get it, but I don't want to keep living with the thought that I lost my chance to be there for him, for you." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable. Avery felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, uncertain of what to do next. Could she trust him again? Could she let him back into their lives, knowing the risk it posed to everything she had built? Before she could respond, the sound of Eli's faint cough interrupted the silence. Both Clara and Declan turned toward the sound, their faces immediately reflecting concern. Clara rushed to Eli's side, her heart in her throat. Declan followed her, his hand instinctively reaching out to her. She paused for a second, torn between trusting him again and protecting herself. As Clara checks on Eli, her mind is still torn. What if Declan is really trying to change? What if she's opening the door to more heartbreak? She's not ready to forgive him, but she has no choice but to let him be part of their lives. For now. But can she ever fully trust him again? The sound of the elevator dinging seemed to pierce the quiet tension that had settled over Clara's apartment. Declan had been here for hours, hovering near the door, unsure whether to leave or to stay. After their conversation, Avery had insisted on taking some time to think, time to process everything that had come to light. Her heart felt as though it were stretched thin, pulled in opposite directions. Trust, protection, independence. What could she really offer him? Could she risk opening her life to the man who had once walked away without a second thought? Eli's condition seemed to worsen as the day dragged on, despite their efforts. The tests had come back inconclusive. The doctors had ordered more scans and said they'd need to watch Eli more closely over the next few days. But the weight of his diagnosis hung in the air, a silent, oppressive presence that no one wanted to acknowledge. Clara had spent the afternoon pacing, distracted by the steady pulse of worry over her son, but also by the weight of Declan's presence. She couldn't ignore the growing tension between them. He had insisted on staying, offering to help in any way he could. He had done everything from preparing food to organizing transportation to the hospital. But something about the whole situation felt unnatural. There was a part of Clara that wanted to believe him, believe that he had truly changed, that his desire to be part of Eli's life was genuine. But there was also the voice that warned her. He had walked away once. He could do it again. Standing at the window, Clara looked out at the city below. The skyline was illuminated by the fading light of day, and she could see the reflection of herself in the glass. It was then that she realized the hard truth. Her life was never going to be the same again. Declan's return had already changed everything. She couldn't go back to the way things were, and she couldn't keep pretending that she didn't still feel something for him. A small part of her still loved him. That was the problem. She wasn't sure how to navigate the territory between her past and the future she wanted for herself and Eli. She turned, and that's when she saw Declan standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her with an unreadable expression. He had been waiting for her to make a decision, waiting for her to tell him if he had a place in their lives again. But Avery knew now that she wasn't the only one struggling with what to do next. He had made his mistakes, and he had walked away. But now he was back, trying to prove that he could still be part of this family. Declan stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his face softening slightly. Clara, I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't change the past, but I want to do right by you and by Eli. I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I'm here. I'm here for both of you. I'll do whatever it takes. The words seemed genuine, and Clara could hear the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't trying to force himself into her life. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. But Clara couldn't ignore the scar tissue left from their years of marriage. The years of his neglect, his emotional absence. He had been there, but he hadn't truly been present. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be okay, Clara said, her voice steady, though there was a faint crack in it. She turned away, trying to steady her breath. She had to focus on Eli, not this old, aching heartache. I don't know if I can let you back in. Not after everything that's happened. I've worked too hard to get this far on my own. Declan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers, the touch sending a surge of emotion through her. Why was this so hard? Why couldn't she let go of the part of her that still wanted him? Why couldn't she push aside the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could get back to what they once were? I don't want to replace everything you've built, he said quietly. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking to be a part of Eli's life. I want to be his father. He deserves that, and so do you. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. The truth was, Eli did deserve a father. Someone who would show up for him, someone who would care. And as much as she hated to admit it, Declan had the potential to be that person. The question was, could she allow him to be? As Clara struggled with the weight of her decision, the phone on the table rang, cutting through the tension. She didn't recognize the number, but she felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she answered. Hello? It was the pediatrician's office again. Clara felt her heart stop. Mrs. West, the nurse on the other end said, her voice urgent. We've just received the results of Eli's tests. We need you to come back in as soon as possible. There's something we need to discuss. Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced at Declan, who had taken a few steps closer, his expression tight with concern. What's wrong? He asked. I don't know, Clara said, her voice shaky. But we have to go. Eli's health is worse than we thought. Declan's eyes darkened, his posture shifting from concern to determination. Let's go, he said firmly. We'll do this together.